The Anderson mansion stood tall in the wealthy suburbs of Atlanta, a picture of luxury with white pillars, shining windows, and a driveway wide enough to host a dozen cars. To the outside world, Richard Anderson was a man who had conquered life. Born in poverty, he had risen through hard work and relentless determination to become one of the city's leading real estate moguls. His story was celebrated in magazines, at conferences, and among business circles as proof that the American dream was real. Beside him was Elizabeth, his wife of 12 years, who always appeared flawless in public. Her hair styled, her dresses immaculate, her smile perfect. Together, they were admired as the model couple, envied by many. But behind those heavy iron gates and polished marble floors, life was not as beautiful as it seemed. Silence filled the mansion more often than laughter, and the warmth of love had long departed. Elizabeth Anderson lived her life as though it were a performance. In public, she was graceful and elegant, the wife who stood proudly beside her successful husband. In private, she often felt more like a ghost drifting through the halls of her own home. The love that had once burned brightly between her and Richard had cooled into habit and duty. They spoke politely, attended events together, and kept up appearances, but deep down Elizabeth longed for affection, for marriage that was more than a partnership on paper. She found some solace in church activities and social gatherings, but even those could not mask the emptiness she felt each night when she retired alone to her side of the grand master bedroom. It was into this world that Clara Johnson arrived, a 22-year-old maid from a small town in Alabama. With soft features and wide, innocent eyes, Clara carried the quiet dignity of someone who had endured hardship but refused to break. Her father had died when she was a child, leaving her mother to raise 4 children alone. Clara had taken on responsibility early, determined to support her family. Working in the Anderson mansion was not her dream, but it was an opportunity. Her modest wages helped her siblings remain in school, and though she lived surrounded by wealth she could never touch, she kept her head high and her heart humble. She moved silently through the halls, sweeping floors, dusting furniture, and serving meals, always careful to avoid drawing too much attention. Richard barely noticed Clara at first. To him, she was just another face among the staff, one more pair of hands ensuring the mansion remained spotless and orderly. But one evening, after returning home from a long day of negotiations, he walked into the kitchen and paused. Clara was at the stove, stirring a pot and softly humming an old tune. The melody struck him like a wave. It was the very song his late mother used to sing when he was a boy growing up in a cramped apartment. For a moment, the mansion disappeared, and Richard was transported back to those days of struggle, watching his mother's tired face glow with warmth as she cooked. Clara turned suddenly, startled by his presence, nearly dropping her spoon. "Good evening, sir," she whispered. Richard cleared his throat. "Good evening. That song, my mother used to sing it." From that night, something shifted. Richard began to notice Clara in ways he hadn't before. The softness in her eyes, the quiet strength in her steps, the gentle hum of her voice that seemed to soften the silence of the house. Clara, for her part, tried to remain invisible, bowing her head and speaking only when necessary. Yet she too felt the weight of his gaze sometimes, and it unsettled her. Elizabeth remained unaware, busy with church events and social duties, while her husband's thoughts increasingly wandered toward the young maid. An invisible thread had been pulled, and though no one could yet see it, the fabric of their lives had begun to unravel. The change began with small conversations. At first, Richard asked Clara harmless questions: where she was from, how long she had worked in Atlanta, how her family was doing. Clara answered politely, always keeping her eyes lowered, but her sincerity caught him off guard. Unlike the polished people who filled his world, Clara spoke simply, without trying to impress. One night, when he found her tidying the living room, he lingered. "You remind me of my mother," he confessed quietly. Clara blinked, unsure how to respond. "She worked hard, just like you, always humming, always carrying everyone on her shoulders. Clara's lips curved into a small, nervous smile. "Sometimes music is the only way to keep going," she said. That simple reply stayed with him long after she had left the room. It was the first time in years Richard had spoken about his mother to anyone, and somehow it felt safe with Clara. Days turned into weeks, and Richard found excuses to pass through whatever part of the house Clara was in. Sometimes it was the kitchen, sometimes the hallway, sometimes the garden. Clara tried to keep her distance, but fate seemed to place them together. One evening, when Elizabeth was away at another church event, Richard lingered in the kitchen doorway. Clara was wiping the counter. "Clara," he said softly, and she froze, glancing up. "You don't have to be so afraid of me." She swallowed hard. "I'm not afraid, sir. I just don't want trouble." He stepped closer, his voice gentler than she had ever heard. "I don't want trouble either. Just company." For the first time, Clara held his gaze. Something unspoken passed between them, something neither of them dared name. Their connection deepened in stolen moments. A late-night conversation in the garden where Clara shared stories of her childhood. A shared laugh when Richard recalled his awkward teenage years. A brush of hands when she handed him a glass of water that lingered longer than it should have. Each encounter wove a fragile web of intimacy, dangerous yet irresistible. Richard felt alive again, reminded of emotions buried under years of business and duty. Clara, torn between fear and warmth, struggled to balance her role as a maid with the strange closeness she felt toward the man of the house. She prayed silently each night for strength, yet when she heard his footsteps, her heart betrayed her prayers. Elizabeth noticed changes, but could not name them. Richard seemed more distracted, often lost in thought. When she asked if work was troubling him, he gave short replies. When she reached for conversation, his answers were polite but empty. She assumed it was stress, telling herself her husband had always carried burdens silently. But sometimes, when she caught his eyes drifting toward the kitchen or pausing as Clara passed by, a cold unease pricked her heart. Elizabeth had long ignored the gaps in their marriage, but now those gaps felt wider. In her quiet moments, she wondered if she was losing her husband, not to business this time, but to something closer, more dangerous. One night, after weeks of suppressed feelings, the boundary finally broke. Richard found Clara in the study, dusting shelves. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. She turned, startled, her eyes wide. "Sir, I didn't know you were," he interrupted gently. "Clara, don't call me sir. Just Richard." She shook her head nervously. "That wouldn't be right." He moved closer, his voice low. "What's right doesn't always feel this strong." Her breath caught as his hand brushed hers, a simple touch that carried the weight of all their unspoken desires. For a moment, the mansion seemed to hold its breath. Clara whispered, "This can't happen." But when his lips met hers, softly at first, then with desperate need, she did not pull away. In that stolen kiss, a line was crossed, and nothing would ever be the same again. After that night, secrecy became their companion. Richard and Clara never spoke of what had happened, yet their stolen glances and quiet touches betrayed the truth. Weeks turned into months, and the weight of their secret grew heavier. Clara began to withdraw, her guilt eating at her. She avoided Elizabeth, terrified that her madam would see the truth in her eyes. But avoiding Richard was harder. He would seek her out, his presence both comforting and suffocating. Then, one morning, Clara stood in the bathroom, staring at the small stick in her hand. 2 pink lines. Her knees buckled. Tears blurred her vision. She was pregnant, and the father was her employer. Fear gripped her chest as she whispered, "God, what have I done?" Clara tried to hide it at first. Loose dresses, quiet movements, excuses about being tired. But Elizabeth was no fool. One afternoon, as Clara carried laundry upstairs, Elizabeth noticed the faint swell under her gown. She said nothing, but suspicion bloomed in her mind. That evening, she confronted Clara gently. You haven't been yourself. Is something wrong? Clara froze. Words caught in her throat. No, ma'am, she whispered. But Elizabeth's instinct sharpened. Later that night, she confronted Richard. Is there something you need to tell me? His silence confirmed her worst fear. He looked away, shame etched into his face. Elizabeth staggered back, her heart breaking. It's her, isn't it? Clara. The truth hung heavy in the room. The house, once filled with quiet routines, now felt like a battlefield. Elizabeth's anger burned, a fire stoked by betrayal. After everything, Richard? After 12 years, she shouted, tears streaming. Richard tried to explain, but no excuse could mend the wound. Clara, caught between shame and sorrow, begged forgiveness. I never meant for this to happen, she cried. But Elizabeth's eyes hardened. You destroyed this family. For days, the mansion echoed with arguments, slammed doors, and suffocating silence. Clara packed her things, ready to leave, but Richard stopped her. You can't just disappear. You're carrying my child. His words only deepened the fracture, binding Clara to a situation she longed to escape. Whispers spread among staff and friends. Elizabeth, humiliated, withdrew from social gatherings. Richard, once admired, became the subject of quiet gossip. Clara lived in the shadows, her pregnancy no longer a secret. The mansion that once represented success now carried the stench of scandal. Yet, amid the shame, Richard felt torn. He could not abandon Clara or the child, but he also could not bear the pain in Elizabeth's eyes. One evening, Elizabeth confronted him one last time. Choose, Richard, your family or your shame. He stood speechless, unable to answer. That silence was her answer. Elizabeth packed her bags, leaving the mansion with nothing but her dignity. Months later, the mansion was quieter than ever. Elizabeth was gone, and Richard wandered the halls like a man haunted. Clara gave birth to a baby boy, his cries filling the emptiness. Richard held his son, torn between pride and regret. Clara, exhausted yet resolute, cradled the child with tears. Their lives had been rewritten by one secret, one choice that could never be undone. The mansion still stood tall on the outskirts of Atlanta, its marble floors polished, its chandeliers glittering. But behind its iron gates, the truth lingered like a shadow. Wealth could buy walls, but it could never contain the price of secrets. Thanks for watching.